December 20th, 1943. Imagine a young pilot, barely 21 years old, gripping the controls of a dying aircraft 30,000 feet above enemy territory, blood freezing on shattered glass, the screams of wounded men drowned out by howling wind through holes torn in metal. Charlie Brown couldn't feel his hands anymore, couldn't remember the last 30 minutes, couldn't understand why his co-pilot was shouting and pointing at the window. When he turned his head, still dizzy from oxygen deprivation, he saw it. A German Messerschmitt Bf 109 flying so close their wingtips nearly touched, the black crosses on its fuselage sharp against December sky. This was the moment every Allied bomber crew feared, the final seconds before cannon fire would tear through aluminum and flesh, sending 10 men screaming into the frozen abyss. But the German pilot wasn't firing, he was staring. And in that stare, in that impossible hesitation above the frost-covered fields of Nazi Germany, something happened that would echo through 70 years of history, reuniting families who never should have existed, proving that even in humanity's darkest hour, a single choice could ripple across generations. This is not a story about technology or tactics. This is a story about the invisible war, the one fought in the human heart when orders collide with conscience, when training confronts compassion, when a man must choose between the medal he's earned and the soul he might lose. The numbers from that December day tell one story. 527 American bombers struck Bremen, 19 B-17s and 5 B-24s were lost, 13 crewmen killed in action, 23 wounded, 227 missing in action. Cold statistics, the mathematics of war. But statistics don't capture the terror of young men watching their aircraft disintegrate around them, don't measure the weight of a mother's telegram, don't calculate the children never born because their fathers spiraled into the North Sea. By late 1943, the psychological casualties among Allied bomber crews had reached crisis levels. Approximately 5,000 to 6,500 men suffered serious combat stress disorders, with possibly thousands more experiencing symptoms they couldn't name, nightmares they couldn't escape, a fatigue that went deeper than exhaustion into something that looked like death of the spirit. They called it being flak happy, or having Focke-Wulf jitters, crude terms for what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that would haunt survivors for decades. The question that December day wasn't just whether Charlie Brown's crew would survive the next 5 minutes. The question was whether any of them could survive what they'd already seen, what they'd already become. And the answer would come from the most unlikely source imaginable, an enemy pilot who'd been taught that mercy was not weakness, but the only thing separating warriors from murderers. To understand why Franz Stiegler didn't pull his trigger that day, you have to go back further, to a Germany that was dying before the war ever started. Franz was born August 21st, 1915, into a world that would betray him 3 times before he turned 30. First in the economic collapse that turned the Weimar Republic into a nightmare of inflation and humiliation, then in the Nazi regime that promised redemption but delivered only catastrophe, and finally in a war that would kill his brother and force him to choose between orders and humanity. Before the war, Franz wasn't a killer. He was a Lufthansa commercial airline pilot, a man who understood the sky as a place of wonder and possibility, who flew routes mapping the future of civilian aviation, dreaming of a world connected by flight rather than divided by borders. But 1942 changed everything. The Luftwaffe conscripted him, and the man who'd flown passengers became a flight instructor, then a fighter pilot, then an ace with 27 confirmed aerial victories. 27 times Franz Stiegler had looked through his gun sight and squeezed the trigger, watching aircraft tumble from the sky, knowing that each silhouette contained men who would never see home again. How does a commercial pilot become a killer? How does a man reconcile the precision required to land safely with the precision required to murder from 300 meters? The answer lies in the man who saved Franz's soul before he lost it. Oberleutnant Gustav Rödel, his commanding officer and mentor, who gave him a code that would define the rest of his life. Gustav Rödel's words were simple, absolute, terrifying in their moral clarity. If I hear of one of you shooting a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself. This wasn't military protocol. This wasn't part of Luftwaffe training. This was one warrior telling another that there were lines you didn't cross, even when crossing them meant victory, even when crossing them was legal, even when crossing them would earn you medals and promotions and the admiration of a nation starving for heroes. Rodel's code emerged from an older tradition of martial honor, a chivalric ethic that insisted warriors must distinguish themselves from butchers, that courage meant restraint as much as aggression, that true strength was measured not by whom you could kill, but by whom you chose to spare. This code had echoes across centuries and cultures, medieval knights offering mercy to any opponent who yielded, samurai announcing themselves before combat rather than attacking through stealth, Muslim warriors limiting their weapons until enemies deployed similar force. The psychological importance of such codes cannot be overstated. Modern research into combat trauma has revealed that warriors who maintain honor codes, who can restore honor to the enemy, recover more successfully from post-traumatic stress disorder, while those who view their enemies as subhuman vermin often find life unendurable even in victory. By giving Franz Stiegler a code, Gustav Rodel gave him something more precious than tactical training. He gave him a lifeline back to his humanity, a way to survive the war not just physically but spiritually. And on December 20th, 1943, that code would be tested in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. On the American side, Charlie Brown was living a different nightmare. 21 years old, this was his first combat mission as a B-17 pilot, his first time leading 10 men into the teeth of German air defenses, his first experience of the terror that had already broken thousands of airmen before him. Brown had trained for this, had practiced formation flying and emergency procedures and evasive maneuvers, but nothing prepares you for the reality of flak explosions that turn the sky into a minefield of shrapnel. Nothing prepares you for the sight of B-17s beside you erupting into fireballs, wings folding, fuselages breaking apart, men tumbling through smoke. His bomber, christened Ye Olde Pub, was supposed to stay in tight formation during the bombing run over Bremen, protected by the concentrated defensive fire of hundreds of machine guns, the flying fortress concept that promised safety in numbers. But war doesn't honor promises. Engine number 4 started running rough for no apparent reason, forcing Brown to shut it down. The aircraft began lagging behind, slipping below the formation, and Brown looked up to see the rear gunners of other B-17s staring down at them, and he knew what they were thinking. Thank God it's not us. Then came the German fighters, 8 Messerschmitts diving from ahead, and Ye Olde Pub fought back, gunners claiming at least 1 kill, possibly 2, before 7 more fighters attacked from the rear. What happened next? Charlie Brown couldn't fully remember. He thinks he lost oxygen and passed out. When consciousness returned, the aircraft was in a steep dive, controls sluggish, the world spinning, and he pulled back with all his strength, leveling out just a few hundred feet above the ground, so low German farmers could see the expressions on crew faces through the shattered plexiglass. The damage assessment was catastrophic. The tail section was nearly half destroyed, hydraulic fluid and blood mixing on metal surfaces, icicles of frozen blood hanging from the gun barrels. The tail gunner was dead, slumped in his position, visible through a gaping hole in the fuselage. 3 other crew members were wounded, 1 critically. 2 engines were failing. The oxygen system was destroyed, the electrical system barely functioning. Sunlight passed completely through the aircraft, holes everywhere, and the fact that Ye Olde Pub was still flying at all defied aerodynamics and probability. Brown faced an impossible decision. Try to reach England, hundreds of miles across occupied territory and the North Sea, in an aircraft that should already be in pieces on the ground. Land in Germany and surrender. Divert to neutral Sweden, saving the crew but abandoning the war effort. He chose England. He pointed the dying bomber west and prayed, not knowing that his guardian angel wore a Luftwaffe uniform and was, at that exact moment, refueling at a German airfield less than 10 miles away. Franz Stiegler had just landed after shooting down 2 B-17s that morning, bringing his total victories to 27. He needed just 3 more bomber kills to reach 30 victories and earn the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military decoration, the medal every fighter pilot dreamed of wearing. He was smoking a cigarette, watching mechanics reload his ammunition and refuel his Messerschmitt, when he heard the roar of damaged engines overhead. Looking up, he saw Ye Olde Pub limping across the sky, so low and slow it seemed to hover, an impossible target, a gift. Stiegler leaped into his cockpit, fired up his engine, and climbed to intercept, adrenaline surging, thinking of the Knight's Cross, thinking of glory, thinking this would be the easiest kill of his career. He closed the distance in seconds, approaching from behind and below, positioning himself for the perfect deflection shot. His thumb moved to the firing button, and then he saw. Through the torn metal and shattered glass, Franz Stigler saw human beings. He saw the dead tail gunner still strapped in position, frozen blood on his flight suit. He saw wounded men being tended by crew members with bandages and morphine. He saw the pilots in the cockpit, young faces tight with fear and exhaustion, struggling with controls that barely responded. He saw daylight passing through the fuselage, saw damage so extensive that the aircraft staying airborne violated every principle of flight he understood. And in that moment, Franz Stigler didn't see an enemy. He saw men in a parachute that couldn't open, defenseless, defeated, no longer combatants but casualties requiring mercy. He remembered Gustav Rödel's words, shooting them would be the same as shooting men in parachutes, an act without honor, murder rather than combat. He also remembered his brother August, a Luftwaffe pilot killed in a training accident, remembered the grief that tore through his family, imagined the American families who would receive telegrams if he pressed the firing button. 27 victories had earned Franz Stigler his reputation. The choice he made next would define his character. Stigler pulled alongside Ye Old Pub, close enough that Charlie Brown could see his face clearly, see the expression that was neither hostile nor friendly, but intensely focused, almost pleading. Brown's first thought was terror. This was it, the end, execution at point-blank range. He screamed down the aircraft for his top turret gunner to shoot the German, to defend them, but the guns didn't fire because the gunner was injured and the systems were damaged. For several minutes, Stigler flew in formation beside the crippled bomber, gesturing, pointing, trying desperately to communicate. He wanted Brown to turn towards Sweden, to land in neutral territory where the crew would receive medical treatment and survive the war as internees. He mouthed the word Sweden, pointed north, waved his arms, but Brown and his crew couldn't understand, thought perhaps this was some kind of trick, some psychological torture before the kill. Stigler realized communication was impossible. He also realized that German anti-aircraft batteries along the coast would absolutely destroy Ye Old Pub the moment they spotted it, that the danger wasn't over just because he'd chosen mercy. So Franz Stigler made a second choice, one even more dangerous than the first. He moved his Messerschmitt into close formation on the bomber's portside wing, so close that German gunners on the ground would see them as a single aircraft, would recognize his Luftwaffe markings, would hold their fire. He became Ye Olde Pub's escort, a German fighter protecting an American bomber through Nazi-occupied territory, risking court-martial and execution if anyone reported what he was doing. They flew together like that for miles, across the German countryside toward the North Sea, an impossible partnership, enemies joined by a code older than national boundaries. When they finally reached the coast, open water ahead, Stigler knew he'd done all he could. Charlie Brown, still uncertain of the Germans' intentions, ordered his dorsal turret gunner to aim at Stigler, not to fire, but to warn him off, to make clear that if this was a trap, they would resist. Franz Stigler saw the gun turret rotate toward him, understood the message, and felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. He looked across the narrow space between aircraft one last time, made eye contact with Charlie Brown, raised his hand in a salute that was equal parts warrior recognition and farewell prayer, then banked away and disappeared into German airspace. Ye Old Pub continued west, alone again, engines failing, fuel running low, men bleeding, but alive. Against all probability, against all logic, they made it across the North Sea and crash-landed at Seething Airfield in England, the aircraft so damaged it would never fly again, but all surviving crew members walking away from the wreckage. During debriefing, Charlie Brown told his superiors about the German fighter that escorted them to safety. The intelligence officers didn't believe him, thought perhaps he'd hallucinated from oxygen deprivation or trauma, classified the report, and ordered Brown and his crew never to speak of the incident again. For the next 46 years, Charlie Brown kept that secret, but he couldn't keep the nightmares. The psychological aftermath of combat trauma can devastate survivors long after physical wounds heal. Charlie Brown completed his required 25 missions and returned home to America, married, built a career, created what looked from the outside like a successful life. But inside, he was still in that crippled bomber, still dying above Germany, still expecting the German fighter to open fire. Night after night he dreamed of Ye Old Pub going down in flames, a Messerschmitt on his wing, the dream always ending in death. This is the invisible cost of war, the casualties that don't appear in official statistics, The men who survive physically but remain trapped in moments of trauma, replaying them endlessly, unable to escape. Research on World War II bomber crews revealed that combat stress disorders were epidemic. Fatigue and fear created approximately 5,000 to 6,500 serious cases, with countless more suffering symptoms they hid or couldn't articulate. Some airmen were branded LMF, lack of moral fiber, and removed from their stations in shame, a brutal misunderstanding of psychological injury that added humiliation to suffering. Charlie Brown was luckier than most. He functioned, held jobs, maintained relationships, but part of him remained in December 1943, frozen in that moment when death seemed certain but somehow never arrived. And the central mystery of his trauma was the German pilot. Who was he? Did he survive the war? Why did he show mercy? Without answers, Brown couldn't process the experience, couldn't integrate it into his understanding of the world, couldn't close the loop that kept him trapped in endless nightmares. Franz Stigler faced different demons. He survived the war, escaping Germany before the Soviet occupation and eventually emigrating to Canada, where he rebuilt his life far from the ruins of his homeland. But he carried secrets too. He never told anyone about the American bomber, about the choice he made that December day, about the Knight's Cross he could have earned but deliberately refused. In the immediate aftermath, when he landed back at his airfield, after escorting Ye Olde Pub to the North Sea, Stigler told no one what he'd done. If his commanding officers learned he'd spared an enemy bomber, if witnesses reported he'd escorted Americans through German airspace, he faced court-martial and likely execution. The Nazi regime did not tolerate mercy, viewed compassion for enemies as treason, punished deviation from orders with brutal efficiency. So Stigler filed no combat report for that sortie, claimed engine trouble or mechanical issues, let the incident disappear into the chaos of war. But he couldn't forget. How could he? In choosing mercy, Franz Stigler had committed the most dangerous act of his life, not dangerous to others but to himself, an act of moral courage that required hiding his greatest moment of humanity as if it were a crime. The war continued. Stigler flew more missions, survived battles that killed most of his squadron, and watched Nazi Germany collapse into apocalypse. When peace finally came, he felt no celebration, only exhaustion and grief for a world destroyed, a brother dead, a country divided, a future uncertain. He immigrated to Canada, worked in business, married, and tried to forget. For 46 years, Charlie Brown searched. Not actively at first. The memories were too raw, the nightmares too frequent, and he'd been ordered to silence. But as decades passed, as he aged and the war receded into history, the mystery haunted him with increasing intensity. Who was the German pilot? In the late 1980s, Brown decided he needed to know, needed to find the man who'd saved his life, needed to understand why. The search seemed impossible. Brown didn't know the pilot's name, didn't know his unit, didn't even have clear photographs, just memories of a face seen briefly through plexiglass and adrenaline. But he had details: the date, the location, the type of aircraft, the extraordinary circumstances. He began writing letters to Luftwaffe veteran organizations, to aviation history groups, to anyone who might connect him with German fighter pilots who flew Messerschmitt Bf 109s near Bremen in December 1943. Most letters went unanswered. Some responses were hostile. Wounds from the war remained fresh for many, and an American bomber pilot asking questions about German aces raised suspicions. Others were apologetic but unhelpful. Too many years had passed, too many records lost, too many pilots dead. Brown persisted, driven by something deeper than curiosity. He needed closure. He needed to thank the man who'd given him the chance to build a life, to marry Jackie, to have children and grandchildren who existed only because a German pilot chose mercy over medals. Then, in January 1990, 46 years and 1 month after the incident, Charlie Brown opened his mailbox and found a letter from Canada. The handwriting was precise, careful, the English grammatically perfect, but with Germanic sentence structure. It began, "I was the pilot of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 that escorted your B-17 over the North Sea on December 20th, 1943. My name is Franz Stigler." Brown's hands shook as he read. The letter contained details no one else could know. The tail gunner clearly dead in his position, the massive holes in the fuselage, the attempts to signal towards Sweden, the escort past German coastal defenses, the final salute. Every detail matched Brown's memories perfectly. This was him, After nearly half a century, the ghost had a name. They arranged a phone call first. Two old men speaking across the distance of decades and former enmity, their voices cracking with emotion as they confirmed what each already knew. This was real, the connection authentic, the mystery solved. Stigler explained what Brown had wondered about for 46 years. His guns had been fully loaded that day. He could have shot down Ye Olde Pub effortlessly, could have earned his Knight's Cross, could have become one of Germany's most decorated aces. But he chose differently because shooting helpless men violated the code Gustav Rödel had taught him, violated his own sense of honor, violated the line separating warriors from murderers. On June 21, 1990, they met in person for the first time since that December day in 1943. Both men were in their mid-70s now, plump and aging, wearing neat ties and formal shirts, looking like retired businessmen rather than warriors who'd once faced each other above Germany with the power of life and death between them. When Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown saw each other at that reunion, they fell into each other's arms and wept. They laughed. They talked about the encounter in light tones at first, almost jovially, as if discussing a strange coincidence rather than the defining moments of their lives. Then someone asked Stigler what he thought about Brown, and the mood shifted. Stigler's square jaw tightened. He grew serious, and he said something that illuminated the psychological complexity of warriors who faced mortal combat. Meeting Charlie Brown, learning about the life he'd lived and the family he'd raised, made Franz Stigler grateful he'd made the right choice, but it also made him confront the weight of his 27 other victories, the men he'd killed, the families he'd destroyed. This is the paradox at the heart of the warrior ethic. You must be capable of killing to protect what you love, but that capability costs you pieces of your soul, pieces you can never fully recover. Gustav Rödel's code didn't make Franz Stigler incapable of combat. It gave him a framework to live with combat, boundaries that preserved his humanity amid the dehumanization of war. Later that summer, Franz attended the reunion of Charlie Brown's bomb group, the 379th in Massachusetts. The moment was surreal. A German fighter ace walking into a room filled with American bomber veterans, men who'd faced Messerschmitts in the sky, who'd watched friends die to Luftwaffe guns. The room fell silent when Franz entered. Then Charlie Brown introduced him, and the silence broke. Men came forward, former crew members of Ye Olde Pub, men Franz had saved without knowing their names or stories. The ball turret gunner, nicknamed Blackie, approached Franz Stigler with tears streaming down his face. He embraced the German pilot and sobbed, thanking him not just for his own life, but for the lives of his children and grandchildren, entire family lines that existed only because Franz chose not to fire. "You allowed my children and grandchildren to experience life," Blackie said, his voice breaking. This moment crystallizes what the title of this story promises. Franz Stigler didn't just save individual men on December 20th, 1943. He saved the families that would descend from them, generations yet unborn, futures that wouldn't exist if he'd squeezed the trigger. Blackie's children, Brown's children, the children of every surviving crew member of Ye Olde Pub, all of them owed their existence to a German pilot's split-second decision to honor a code over ambition, mercy over medals, conscience over orders. The psychological impact on Franz was profound. He'd lived for decades with the memory of that day, wondering if the bomber had made it, if the crew survived, if his choice mattered. Now he knew. Now he could see the faces of the children and grandchildren, could understand the scope of what one act of mercy could create. After that reunion, Charlie Brown's nightmares stopped. For 46 years, he dreamed of dying in that bomber, the Messerschmitt always bringing death. But now he understood. The German pilot wasn't his killer, but his savior. The dream's ending had been wrong. The truth was mercy rather than murder. Understanding this, integrating this, Brown's psyche could finally release the trauma it had held for nearly 5 decades. This is the power of restoring honor to the enemy that research on combat PTSD emphasizes. Warriors who can view their opponents as honorable, as capable of nobility and restraint, recover more successfully than those who dehumanize them. Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown didn't just meet once and part. They became friends, genuine friends, brothers forged not in shared cause but in shared understanding of war's complexity. They took fishing trips together, flew cross-country to visit each other's homes, traveled to schools and veteran reunions to tell their story. Their wives, Jackie Brown and Haya Stigler, became close friends as well. the four of them forming a bond that transcended national boundaries and historical enmities. For the next 18 years, from 1990 until 2008, they were inseparable. They appeared in documentaries, gave interviews, collaborated with author Adam Makos on the book A Higher Call, which would bring their story to millions of readers worldwide. Their message was consistent. War brings out both the worst and best in humanity. Honor matters even when it costs you dearly, and the codes warriors live by can save not just enemy lives, but the warriors' own souls. Young people listening to their presentations saw two old men who'd once been mortal enemies sitting side by side, finishing each other's sentences, laughing at shared jokes, and the lesson was undeniable. If these two could find friendship after facing each other in combat, perhaps reconciliation was possible anywhere. In March 2008, Franz Stiegler died in Canada at the age of 92. 8 months later, in November 2008, Charlie Brown followed him. They'd found each other after 46 years of separation, spent 18 years as brothers, and died the same year, as if their lives were so intertwined that neither could long survive without the other. One veteran, reflecting on their story, said, "I'm pretty sure that when Charlie Brown left this earth, he was met by Franz Stiegler, who guided him up that heavenly stairway." The legacy of Franz Stiegler and Charlie Brown extends far beyond their personal story. Their experience illuminates crucial psychological and cultural dimensions of warfare that often get buried beneath tactical analysis and strategic history. First, it demonstrates the crucial importance of warrior codes in maintaining humanity during combat. Research consistently shows that soldiers who operate within ethical frameworks, who maintain honor codes that restrain violence and distinguish combatants from non-combatants, suffer less severe psychological trauma and reintegrate more successfully into civilian society. Gustav Rodel's code didn't make Franz Stiegler weak. It made him strong enough to resist the dehumanizing pressures of war, to maintain moral discernment when orders and opportunity aligned to make murder easy. Second, the story reveals how mercy can have ripple effects across generations. When we calculate the costs of war, we count immediate casualties, the dead, wounded, captured. But Franz Stiegler's choice reminds us that every life saved is also every descendant of that life, extending forward through time in ways impossible to quantify. Blackie's gratitude for his children and grandchildren makes this concrete. How many people exist today because Franz Stiegler didn't fire? How many marriages, careers, artistic creations, scientific discoveries, simple moments of joy trace back to that December day? Third, the 46-year gap between the incident and the reunion highlights the long tail of combat trauma and the healing power of understanding. Charlie Brown suffered nightmares for nearly half a century because he couldn't process what happened, couldn't reconcile the German fighter pilot with any framework that made sense. Was the pilot toying with him, planning to shoot but experiencing mechanical failure? Acting on orders Brown didn't understand. Without answers, Brown's psyche kept replaying the trauma, trying to solve the mystery, unable to achieve closure. When he finally learned the truth, when he could reframe the Messerschmitt pilot as heroic rather than threatening, the nightmares stopped. This has profound implications for how we treat veterans and process collective historical trauma. Opportunities for former enemies to meet, to share perspectives, to humanize each other, can facilitate healing in ways traditional therapy alone cannot achieve. Fourth, the cultural dimension of the story reveals how acts of individual conscience can challenge nationalistic narratives. Nazi Germany demanded absolute loyalty, total war, dehumanization of enemies. Franz Stiegler's choice was an act of resistance against that ideology, proof that even within totalitarian systems, individual moral agency persists. Similarly, the Allied command's skepticism of Brown's account, their classification of the report and order to keep silent, reflects discomfort with narratives that complicate the clean division between us and them. Both sides wanted simple stories, Germans as inhuman monsters or heroic defenders, Americans as liberators or enemy invaders. The truth that warriors on both sides could display honor and mercy challenges simplistic propaganda and demands more nuanced understanding. In our contemporary moment, when conflicts increasingly involve dehumanization of opponents, when propaganda reduces complex humans to cartoon villains, the Stiegler-Brown story offers a counter-narrative worth preserving. Fifth, the friendship that developed between Franz and Charlie demonstrates the universal human capacity for connection across enormous divides. These men shared no common language initially, fought for opposing nations, had every reason to view each other as enemies. Yet they became brothers because they recognized in each other something deeper than nationality, a shared understanding of war's horror, a commitment to honor over expedience, a willingness to risk everything for principle. The technological context of their encounter is worth noting as well. The B-17 Flying Fortress and Messerschmitt Bf-109 were among the most sophisticated military technologies of their era, machines designed with extraordinary precision to kill efficiently. Military-industrial complexes on both sides poured enormous resources into developing aircraft that could fly higher, faster, farther, carry more bombs, fire more accurately. Engineers and designers worked tirelessly to maximize lethality, minimize vulnerability, optimize the mathematics of death. Yet in the end, the most consequential decision made that December day had nothing to do with technology. It came down to one man's choice, a human decision that no amount of engineering could predict or control. Franz Stiegler's Messerschmitt functioned perfectly. His guns were loaded, his ammunition plentiful, his aircraft undamaged, his tactical position ideal. The technology performed exactly as designed, but the human operating the technology made a choice the designers never anticipated. He used his lethal position to provide mercy rather than death, to escort rather than destroy, to honor a code that transcended national interest. This tension between technological capability and human moral agency is central to understanding warfare in the modern age. We create weapons of enormous sophistication, then place them in the hands of 19-year-olds and 21-year-olds, and expect them to make life and death decisions in seconds under conditions of extreme stress. Sometimes, as the statistics from the Bremen raid show, the result is terrible loss. 19 B-17s shot down, 13 killed, 23 wounded, 227 missing. Sometimes, as Franz Stiegler proved, the result is mercy that ripples across generations. The cultural memory of World War II has evolved significantly since 1945. For decades, narratives focused on national triumph or tragedy, on strategic victories and tactical innovations, on the grand sweep of history. Individual stories like Stiegler and Brown's remained buried, classified, forgotten, incompatible with simplified narratives that made post-war reconstruction and Cold War alliances easier to navigate. But in recent decades, as veterans have aged and archives have opened, these human stories have emerged, complicating our understanding in valuable ways. The Stiegler-Brown incident, popularized by Adam Makos's book, A Higher Call, has reached millions of readers precisely because it offers something sanitized military history cannot: insight into the psychological and moral dimensions of combat, proof that honor and mercy can survive even in war's worst extremes. For younger generations learning about World War II, stories like this provide entry points into empathy, ways to understand warriors not as abstractions or stereotypes, but as complex humans facing impossible choices. When students hear about Franz Stiegler choosing mercy over medals, choosing conscience over orders, they learn that individual moral agency matters, that even within rigid systems, people can choose compassion. When they learn that Charlie Brown suffered nightmares for 46 years until meeting his former enemy brought healing, they understand that war's costs extend far beyond physical casualties into realms of psychological trauma that last lifetimes. These are lessons no amount of statistics about tonnage dropped or armies mobilized can teach. They require human stories, specific individuals making specific choices in specific moments, stories we can emotionally connect with and learn from. The question of why Franz Stiegler showed mercy also invites us to consider broader issues of moral education and military culture. Gustav Rodel's code, passed from mentor to student in a personal relationship, proved more influential in the crucial moment than official Luftwaffe doctrine or Nazi ideology. This suggests that moral formation happens primarily through relationships and examples rather than through formal instruction. Warriors need not just tactical training, but ethical mentorship, models of honor who embody the restraint and discernment that separate legitimate defense from atrocity. The U.S. Military Code of Conduct, formalized in 1955, attempted to create such an ethical framework, defining how American service members should behave in combat, captivity, and peace. But codes written on paper matter less than codes written on the heart through relationships with trusted mentors. Franz didn't spare Charlie Brown because he'd read a regulation. He spared him because Gustav Rudel had looked him in the eye and said, "If I hear of one of you shooting a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." That personal transmission of values, warrior to warrior, created a moral compass stronger than ideology or ambition. For contemporary military forces navigating complex ethical terrain, where enemies may not wear uniforms and civilians become human shields, this lesson is critical. Moral restraint in warfare must be cultivated through relationships, mentorship, and a culture of honor that values conscience as much as courage. Technology will continue advancing, weapons will grow more lethal, and the capacity for destruction will keep expanding. But the choice to pull the trigger or hold fire will always be human, and that choice will be shaped by the codes warriors carry and the mentors who taught them. The reunion between Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown in 1990 sparked significant media attention, leading to documentaries, interviews, and eventually Makos's book. But perhaps more importantly, it created opportunities for other World War II veterans to share similar stories of mercy and unexpected honor. The narrative space opened by Stigler and Brown's public friendship allowed other warriors to speak about moments when enemies showed humanity, when combat paused for compassion, when the lines between friend and foe blurred in surprising ways. A Christmas truce story from 1944, when German and American soldiers shared a cabin during the Battle of the Bulge, protecting each other rather than fighting, emerged from obscurity because the Stigler-Brown story proved audiences were ready to hear complexity. A story of German soldier Friedrich Lengfeld, who died trying to rescue a wounded American soldier from no man's land, gained recognition for similar reasons. These stories don't negate the genuine evil perpetrated by Nazi Germany. The Holocaust remains history's clearest example of industrialized genocide, an atrocity that demands eternal remembrance and vigilance against repetition. But acknowledging that some German soldiers maintained honor codes, that some showed mercy, that some resisted the dehumanizing pressure of Nazi ideology, doesn't excuse the regime's crimes. If anything, it makes them more disturbing, because it proves that Germans were not monsters, but humans who nonetheless participated in or tolerated monstrous acts. Individual acts of mercy, like Stigler's, highlight the moral choices available even within evil systems, making those who didn't choose mercy less able to claim they had no alternative. The psychological research on post-traumatic stress disorder and combat trauma has validated much of what Charlie Brown experienced and what his meeting with Franz Stigler resolved. Modern understanding recognizes that trauma often involves unresolved questions and ambiguous situations that the mind keeps trying to process, replaying memories in search of meaning or closure. Brown's recurring nightmares featured the Messerschmitt on his wing, but the nightmare always ended in death because he couldn't understand why the German didn't fire, couldn't integrate the experience into a coherent narrative. This ambiguity kept the trauma active, unresolved, producing symptoms for decades. When he finally met Stigler and learned the true story, the ambiguity disappeared. The Messerschmitt pilot became heroic rather than threatening. The memory transformed from impending doom to miraculous rescue. With this reframing, Brown's psyche could finally process and integrate the experience, allowing the nightmares to stop. This therapeutic power of understanding, of narrative coherence, of restoring honor to the enemy, has enormous implications for treating combat veterans. Programs that facilitate dialogue between former enemies, that allow warriors to share perspectives and humanize each other, may offer healing benefits traditional therapy alone cannot provide. The Veterans History Project and similar initiatives that record and preserve personal accounts serve not just archival purposes, but potentially therapeutic ones, helping veterans construct coherent narratives from chaotic memories, find meaning in traumatic experiences, and connect with others who understand in ways civilians cannot. The enduring fascination with the Stigler-Brown story, evident in its continued circulation online, its adaptation into various media formats, and its presence in educational curricula, suggests it fulfills deep cultural needs. We hunger for stories that complicate simple narratives, that reveal moral complexity, that demonstrate human capacity for nobility, even in war's depths. In an age of increasing polarization, where political and cultural divides often feel insurmountable, a story of former mortal enemies becoming brothers offers hope that reconciliation is possible, that understanding can bridge even the most violent divisions. The visual image of two elderly men, one German and one American, embracing and weeping at their reunion carries emotional power that transcends specific historical context and speaks to universal themes of forgiveness, friendship, and redemption. Educational use of the story in schools introduces young people to World War II through a lens that emphasizes individual moral agency rather than inevitability, human connection rather than dehumanization, mercy rather than merely victory. Students learning this story don't just memorize dates and battles, they confront genuine moral dilemmas. What would you do in Franz Stiegler's position? Is career advancement worth compromising your conscience? How do you maintain humanity when surrounded by dehumanization? These questions, raised by the Stigler-Brown encounter, have relevance far beyond World War II, applying to any situation where personal ethics conflict with institutional pressure or national ideology. The technological innovations of World War II, from radar to jet engines to atomic weapons, receive enormous historical attention, and rightly so. These innovations transformed warfare and shaped the post-war world in profound ways. But the Stigler-Brown story reminds us that the most important innovations may be moral rather than technological, codes of honor that restrain violence, cultural traditions that value enemy lives, psychological insights that recognize the long-term costs of atrocity. Gustav Rödel's simple rule, "Don't shoot men in parachutes," was an innovation in the sense that it preserved humanity amid industrial slaughter, creating boundaries that acknowledged shared human dignity even between combatants. This moral innovation, passed from mentor to student and honored in the crucial moment, ultimately had greater positive impact than many celebrated technological developments because it saved specific lives, prevented specific traumas, allowed specific families to exist. If we're going to remember World War II accurately, we need to remember both the technologies that destroyed and the moral codes that preserved, both the innovations that killed and the choices that spared, both the systems that dehumanized and the individuals who resisted. As the last World War II veterans age and die, their personal testimonies become increasingly precious. Charlie Brown and Franz Stiegler died in 2008, taking with them first-hand memories of combat that no book or documentary can fully capture. But they left behind their story, preserved in multiple formats, accessible to future generations who will need to understand not just what happened in World War II, but how it felt, what moral dilemmas warriors faced, how trauma affected survivors, and how mercy could survive amid industrial killing. Their friendship, forged from mercy and sustained through understanding, models reconciliation in ways political treaties and diplomatic agreements cannot. The image of these two old warriors, once trying to kill each other and then spending their final years as brothers, fishing together and telling their story together, offers hope that even the deepest divisions can be bridged by courage, honesty, and willingness to see former enemies as fellow humans. This legacy extends beyond their individual lives into cultural memory, where their story joins other narratives of unexpected mercy and improbable friendship that help us understand humanity's capacity for both terrible evil and redemptive good. In a century that witnessed the Holocaust, atomic weapons, and total war, the story of Franz Stiegler, choosing mercy over medals, provides necessary counterbalance, proof that moral agency persisted even in history's darkest hours, that honor codes mattered even when breaking them would bring reward, that individual choices could ripple across generations in ways warriors themselves might never know. Now, 77 years after that December day above Germany, the full scope of Franz Stiegler's choice has become visible. We can trace the family lines that wouldn't exist without his mercy. Charlie Brown's children and grandchildren, who organized reunions and preserved their father's story. The ball turret gunner Blackie's descendants, who wouldn't have been born if Stiegler had fired. The families of other crew members, each with their own trees of descendants branching forward through time. We can measure the psychological healing that came when Brown finally understood the truth, when nightmares that had haunted him for 46 years finally stopped, when trauma transformed into triumph. We can observe the cultural impact as their story has been shared millions of times, teaching new generations that enemies can become brothers, that honor matters even when it costs you, that codes of conduct can save souls as well as lives. And we can reflect on the mentorship chain, Gustav Rödel teaching Franz Stiegler, Franz Stiegler teaching through his example, the story teaching all who encounter it that warriors bear responsibility not just for whom they kill, but for whom they spare, that true courage includes restraint, that honor sometimes requires letting your enemy go. This is the hidden technology of warfare that rarely appears in military histories. The transmission of moral codes from warrior to warrior, the cultivation of conscience that allows humans to remain human even when authorized to kill, the psychological mechanisms that protect souls from being consumed by the violence they commit. If we're looking for heroes in World War II, we rightly celebrate those who fought Nazi Germany, who liberated concentration camps, who defeated totalitarianism at terrible cost. But we should also remember Franz Stiegler, whose heroism took a different form, not the courage to kill but the courage to spare, not the strength to destroy, but the strength to protect, not the willingness to follow orders, but the willingness to follow conscience, even when conscience contradicted orders, and cost him the medal he'd nearly earned. His heroism was quieter, more private, more dangerous in some ways because it required him to risk court-martial and execution not from enemy action, but from his own side's judgment. And we should remember Charlie Brown, whose heroism included not just surviving combat, but surviving trauma, not just flying damaged aircraft to safety, but living with memories that wouldn't leave him alone, not just completing his war service, but searching for decades until he could find the truth that would set him free. Both men displayed courage, but different kinds. The courage to show mercy and the courage to seek understanding, virtues we need as much in our time as in theirs. The title of this story promises that a German soldier saved his American rival without knowing it would reunite families, and that promise has been fulfilled in the telling. Franz Stiegler didn't know, in December 1943, that his choice would allow Blackie to have children and grandchildren, would give Charlie Brown a life of marriage and family, would create friendship between former enemies that would last decades. He couldn't have known these outcomes. He simply saw human beings in a dying aircraft, remembered his mentor's code, thought of his dead brother and the grief families endure, and chose mercy. The families reunited because of his choice. The Brown family, the families of other crew members, and in a metaphorical sense the human family that transcends national boundaries and ideological divisions, exist as living testimony that individual moral choices matter, that honor codes save lives, that mercy ripples across generations in ways we can never fully predict. This is perhaps the most important lesson from their story. We never know the full consequences of our choices, never see all the lives touched by our actions or inactions, never completely understand how mercy or cruelty will echo through time. But the choice remains ours, in moments large and small, to honor conscience or ignore it, to see enemies as humans or as targets, to follow codes that restrain violence, or to abandon them for expedience. So what do we do with this story? With this gift from two old warriors who shared their experience so future generations might learn? We remember, first of all, we preserve their names. Franz Stiegler, who flew a Messerschmitt Bf 109 above Bremen on December 20th, 1943, and chose mercy. Charlie Brown, who piloted Ye Old Pub through hell and lived to search for the German who saved him. Gustav Rödel, whose code of honor saved more than just enemy lives. It saved his student's soul. We remember the crew of Ye Olde Pub, the men whose families exist because they survived. Blackie in the ball turret, weeping with gratitude 47 years later. The radio operator, the navigator, all those who went home because Franz Stiegler held his fire. We honor the mentorship that passed moral courage from one generation of warriors to the next. The relationship between Rödel and Stiegler that ultimately preserved 10 American lives and influenced millions through their story. We acknowledge the complexity of war, refusing simplified narratives that make one side purely evil and the other purely good. Instead, recognizing that honor and atrocity could coexist, that individual Germans could show mercy even while their nation committed genocide, that moral choices remained available even in systems designed to eliminate them. We learn from the psychological dimensions of their experience, how trauma can last decades, how understanding can heal, how nightmares can finally stop when ambiguity resolves into truth. And we commit to carrying forward the codes that make such mercy possible, teaching young warriors that honor matters, that restraint is strength, that seeing enemies as human doesn't make you weak, but makes you worthy of the power you wield. The story of Franz Stiegler and Charlie Brown isn't ultimately about World War II, though that's its setting. It's about humanity's capacity for mercy when mercy seems impossible, for connection when connection seems forbidden, for honor when honor seems costly. It's about the invisible war fought in the human heart, where conscience battles expedience, where codes of honor contend with orders and ambition, where the choice to spare or kill defines not just your enemy's fate, but your own soul. It's about families reunited not just through Stigler and Brown's friendship, but through the very existence of descendants who wouldn't have been born without mercy. It's about nightmares that lasted 46 years and finally stopped when understanding replaced mystery. It's about two old men falling into each other's arms and weeping, forgiving what needed forgiving, honoring what needed honoring, becoming brothers despite everything that should have kept them enemies. It's about a German soldier who saved his American rival and in doing so saved himself. It's about warrior codes that transcend national boundaries and historical periods, that preserve humanity even in war's depths, that create possibilities for healing and reconciliation when combat ends. Most of all, it's about the ripple effects of single moments, single choices, single acts of conscience that echo across generations in ways we can never fully measure, but can occasionally glimpse when an old man thanks his former enemy for allowing his grandchildren to live. Now, it's your turn. Did your family have experiences in World War II that shaped the generations that followed? Have you encountered moments when showing mercy felt dangerous but necessary? Do you know veterans struggling with trauma who might benefit from understanding, from connecting with former enemies, from reframing their memories? What codes of honor guide your choices when the stakes are high and no one's watching? The story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown isn't just history to study. It's a mirror to examine our own lives, our own choices, our own capacity for mercy or cruelty. Share your reflections in the comments. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, especially young people learning about war, veterans processing trauma, anyone who believes enemies can never become friends. Hit the like button if this story moved you, because that helps others find it. Subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into World War II's human dimensions, the psychological and cultural perspectives that transform dry history into living lessons. And hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next video, where we'll explore another innovation that humanized war's technology, the medics who crossed front lines to save enemies, risking everything to honor their healing oaths, even when nations demanded killing. Until then, remember, every choice echoes, every mercy ripples, every moment of conscience matters more than we know. Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown proved it. Now their story is yours to carry forward.